Alright, welcome back to the second lecture in our Iran series. Last time we looked at Iran prior to the Islamic Revolution. Today we look at that revolution itself and the constitution of the new Islamic Republic that resulted from that revolution. The events of 1978-1979 had been a long time coming. If we want a starting point, we can say that the exile of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in 1964 is a good place to start. Spoken out against the Shah's relationship with the United States and the West, arguing that Iranian independence had been sold to colonizing powers. Things began to accelerate, though, in the summer of 1978, when open demonstrations against the regime began. By the end of that summer, on September 8th, martial law was declared. However, very soon it became apparent that many elements of the police and military were going to side with the demonstrators. After a long winter of discontent, the 16th of January 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran for the last time. 2 weeks later, Ruhollah Khomeini returned and said at the airport, "These people are trying to bring back the regime of the late Shah or another regime. I will strike with my fist at the mouths of this government. From now on, it is I who will name the government." Up to this point, the revolution had been, or I should say the revolution had Islamic elements, but it was not an Islamic revolution. Let me restate that. Up to this point, the movement to topple the Shah's government had Islamic elements, but it wasn't an Islamic revolution. Once the Ayatollah Khomeini returns, he co-opts the non-Islamic elements and turns it into a wholly Islamic revolution. You can argue that Ruhollah Khomeini does not cause the revolution. After all, he's in Paris when it begins and does not return until February 1st, 1979. But he takes advantage of the situation and pushes aside the secular elements. In part, this was possible because, as we learned in the documentary last time, Savak had systematically destroyed much of that secular opposition. Just as the Arab revolt in the 1930s had destroyed much of the Palestinian leadership, paving the way for an Israeli Jewish victory in 1948, so too had Savak destroyed much of the secular opposition that here in 1979 might have been able to stand up to Ruhollah Khomeini had it still existed. We have two pieces of primary source evidence for the new leader of Iran, Ruhollah Khomeini. We have an interview from May 6, 1978. But before we get to that, I'd like to play a clip of Mike Wallace from 60 Minutes interviewing Ruhollah Khomeini after he had returned to Iran in 1979. Let's look first at the clip, then we'll talk about the interview done in Paris here in 1978 that we have in text.
Imam President Sadat of Egypt, a devoutly religious man, a Muslim, says that what you are doing now is, quote, a disgrace to Islam. And he calls you, Imam, forgive me, his words, not mine, a lunatic. I know that you have heard that comment.
What do you mean by lunatic, madman?
That's what I heard President Sadat say on American television.
Yes.
that the Imam is a disgrace to Islam, and he used the word a lunatic.
حضرت امام آقای سادات رئیس جمهور مصر که یک مرد بسیار مذهبی و یک مسلمان هستش گفتن که با عرض معذرت از جسارت که گفته ایشون نیست
سادات ادعای اسلام می‌کند.
Sadat states he is a Muslim,
دشمن‌های اسلام
and we are not.
حمله می‌کند.
He is not, for he compromises with the enemies of Islam.
می‌داند
The Egyptian people do not back Sadat.
I demand that Egyptian people try to overthrow him just as we did with the Shah.
In 1982, a year after the hostages were freed, Anwar Sadat was assassinated.
And why was Anwar Sadat assassinated? Well, we know why Anwar Sadat was assassinated. He was assassinated because he'd made peace with the Israelis at the Camp David Accords, 1978, something we saw in the last lecture from the Israel series. Let's turn now, though, to the documentary evidence we have. This May 1978 interview done in Paris, published first in Le Monde, the major French national daily newspaper. There's a lot going on in here. I'd like to go through it piece by piece. The first question addresses the issue of labels, as does the second question. Reactionary, Islamic Marxist. Labels that had been imposed on this movement from the outside. First question, the Shah accuses you and the other religious leaders of being obscurantist and reactionary. The Ayatollah's answer here is interesting, and we're going to see it again in the Constitution. He discusses social programs, economic development. He contends that, far from being reactionary, he's actually progressive. Something that I would agree with in large measure, something we will see in the Constitution. The second question, Islamic Marxist label, again imposed from the outside. Islamic-Marxist, as he notes, probably Riley, is an oxymoron. It's impossible. The Islamist movement saw in Marxism in left-leaning movements, in things like Amal, in things like Fatah and the PLO. Islamist movements see in those an irreligiousness. I'm not sure if that's a word, but I'm going to use it. Because at its core, there is no religion in Marxism. And this is the primary critique of Hamas for the PLO and Hezbollah for the PLO and Hezbollah for Amal, closer to home in Lebanon. Moving on through this interview, Israel's addressed, something that the Ayatollah Khomeini argues that Israel is a usurpation, that Israel has usurped Muslim people's land and committed innumerable crimes by maintaining diplomatic relations with Israel and granting economic aid to that country. The Shah is going against the interest of Islam. Excuse me, I just sneezed 4 times there. Whew. Okay. The United States is addressed here after Israel. In my proclamations, I have several times defined my attitude toward the United States and the other big powers which exploit the wealth of poor countries. After the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was nationalized in 1953, the United States came to its rescue and began to largely run the operation in Iran after that point, as it was running the operation in Saudi Arabia up through the 1970s as Aramco. He mentions here the 1953 coup d'etat, something that Iranians still talk about. 56 years later, something they have not forgotten.